Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. My name is Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to shoot out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or you can reach me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at Fossadon.org. So, all right, with that out of the way, I'm really looking forward to my conversation. We were talking about some fun stuff before, and let's just get right into it. So, my guest today is Phil Haack. Phil, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Phil Haack. I am currently a CTO and co-founder of a serious business. We make Abbot, which is what was that me? Sorry, phone. Um, we make a series, Abbot, which is a customer success bot. And I used to work at Microsoft, where I'm probably most well known for working on ASP.NET MVC and NuGet. And then after that, I was at GitHub, where I worked on all the different client applications. And after GitHub, I started this company with my friend Paul and several other ex-GitHubbers, and one Keith Dalby as well, who's not an ex-GitHubber, but important to
Awesome.
know.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think that, you obviously have a passion for technology, and one of the things that I love talking with folks about is how they got started in tech. So, like, I love the idea of origin stories. Like, do you remember the first time that technology introduced itself to you and you said, like, this is it? Like, this is what I enjoy doing?
Yeah, I sort of had two phases. When I was a kid, this a very long time ago, and this will date myself because my dad brought home a TRS-80, and it was the TRS-80 color computer. And I remember, like, back then, like, buying a computer, it was kind of a big deal. They're very expensive, and we stored our, we didn't have disk drives, we had a tape deck, and so we would and we often didn't, this pre-internet, pre all of that,
Sure.
right? And so, like, if we wanted a game, I remember we would, like, buy a book and it'd have listings in basic, and then
Yeah.
at the very end, a bunch of, like, machine code. You just type in 0101. Well, actually it's hex, but you just type in all these characters in, pages and pages of characters, and then try to run the program and then try to debug it. But then eventually you'd get the game to work. And one of the first ones we did was like a pole position style game where you're driving, and I would try to write my own little basic programs and, like, try to do artwork using basic. And I think it was then that I really got hooked. After the TRS-80, I got the Commodore 128, which is basically just a glorified Commodore 64, and then the Commodore Amiga. But I at that time I got really into gaming on the
Sure.
computers, and so I
Sure.
sort of didn't really get into programming. Like, I used to program as a kid, and then once I got into gaming, that's all I wanted to do with the computer. And then it was in college. I was a math major, but I wanted to take at least one computer class. I took a C programming language class, and when I was getting close to graduating, I remember thinking, wow, I have a lot of student debt, and
Sure.
I could go to grad school and accrue even more student debt, or maybe I'll just, like, see what's out there. I'll get a job for a couple years and then go to grad school. And so I got a job at a little custom software shop in Seal Beach, California, which is um, just south of LA. And turned out we were doing classic ASP,
Hmm.
so not .NET, it's pre.NET, uh, ASP, SQL Server, and building websites for actually some big companies. We did something for a company called, what was it called? My Launch, which later got bought by Yahoo and became part of Yahoo Music. We did, like, stuff for Levi's and all that, and we were a tiny little shop. But I think once I, started, like, building websites that were dynamic and using, classic ASP and JavaScript, like, I just got hooked. It was so much fun, and started getting paid well, and
Yeah.
I kind of lost all interest in going back to grad school.
Yeah, I mean that Thanks for the little backstory. I think the one thing that's very very interesting to me always about computer, especially people in computing, and most of the folks I talk to, like they do have like there's some overlap with like video games, right? Was there a point in
Hmm.
time when you thought like, oh, maybe I'll like build video games, like maybe I'll do that as a career?
It's funny because like I loved playing them, but and I always thought like, oh, it'd be cool, but I just found like sometimes you kind of quickly recognize where your talents lie and where they don't lie.
Sure.
And I realized like I just had no idea how to even get started. And
Mm-hmm.
so and I played around. I think there was one video game kind of builder back in the day, and I played around with it, and I was like, nah, I'd rather just play these.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think also too people have like this false I guess false belief of like what building video games actually is, right? And then you actually talk to friends in the industry that build video games, you're like, "Oh, that sounds not super exciting for me."
Yeah. It
Yeah, I mean,
it
so yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, so I used to work with someone named Andrea Gaeta. She goes by Shauna on all the internet, and she has a lot of experience with gaming. And she's like, oh, writing games, especially in Unity and C Sharp, like the type of C Sharp you used to writing for, Microsoft, is going to be very different from the
Yeah.
type of C Sharp you write for a game. And some of it you're gonna barf at, but some of it you're gonna be like, oh, this is, like very efficient, but I would
Hmm.
never write a business app like this. So
Yeah.
it's a very different beast. I did go to one Unity conference and, you know, did one of the, workshops there. And it has come a long way in terms of building how
Yeah.
you build games today. And that did make me think, oh, like this would be a fun hobby to do at some point, like when I'm, done with my normal work. But it is a lot of fun to build games in Unity.
Yeah, it's crazy too thinking about, you mentioned specifically I had a friend in college who was like very into like the 3D rendering part of games, like the building like like manipulating polygons and things like that, and he was kind of showing me like how he was doing it. I think he was using, I don't know, whatever the tool was at the time. I can't remember the name of it. And I just immediately was like, that's way over my head. Like I will
Hmm.
never understand how that works. Like you said, I know where my skills lie and it's not in that area.
Yeah.
So, I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about. So, you got your first job out of school. You mentioned kind of like the decision of like, do I continue my education or do I get a job, sort of thing. And you started working in Classic ASP. And when I think of Classic ASP, I got started in Classic ASP as well. It's like, oh, so you like build like line of business apps for some random company, and they were a Microsoft shop, so Classic ASP was the way to go. Did you realize
Hmm.
pretty quickly that, and, not to forecast a little bit into your career, but like, working with a specific sort of technology, like you just felt comfortable and you kind of continued working in those sort of things on and on and on?
Yeah, a lot of people like I definitely agree. Like as much as possible, use the right tool for the right job. But I think in most situations, there's a lot of right tools for the same
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the it's kind of like you're for like people's religions are determined by where they're born for the most part, right?
Yes.
Or who your family is. And I think it's kind of like your first job will have a huge influence on what technology stack you use. And so I'm sure if I had joined a PHP shop, I probably would have like just stayed in the PHP community, because I don't think any one of these are so far and head and shoulders beyond the others. I think
Hmm.
what ends up happening is you sort of retrofit
Oh, sure.
your
Yeah.
judgments, right? Like I think .NET is a fantastic stack, um, and I'm happy to use it. I love, and I have used other stacks now, and I still prefer .NET.
Hmm.
But I'm also self-aware enough, I hope, to know that like part of that is just my heritage in terms of my work. Because
Yeah.
at that job, when we were building classic HP, but even then I knew that, oh, I can't write the code the way I want to write it, right? Like
Sure.
it's spaghetti. No matter how hard I try, it just keeps ending up becoming spaghetti.
So many
And so
response.writes everywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and like you couldn't really put things in classes or objects. And so I started experimenting with com objects using J was it Microsoft's early Java. and then regular Java, like there was a way you could call, you could write Java objects, and then would write COM objects in VB. But you have the issues with apartment threading and putting those objects in session, which is where sometimes you wanted them. Of course, later we realized that no, that's a bad idea. Keep everything stateless. But we would write a lot of COM components in VB because then we could have a full
Yeah.
IDE and nice, object-oriented code. And then, we heard this thing about cool, which later became C#. And I was like, oh, that sounds neat. And my company sent me and me and one other person to a class by Jeffrey Richter up in
Oh
Redmond
wow. Yeah.
way back in the day. And so it was like one of the first classes he was doing on C# and .NET. And after that, I was like, we have to do everything in this.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we were able to switch over.
Yeah, I worked at a company like I said, my first job was like classic ASP for an insurance company, right? And I remember like the tipping point is like, okay, now we're going to take all of these old apps and make them like proper .NET apps, right? And this was like to
Hmm.
date myself, like this is the point in time when like WCF like really started to gain a lot of traction. So it's like, oh, we're gonna move all these services into web services, and we're gonna have all these front ends, like the beginning of the SPA thing. And I remember
Hmm.
it's like, why are we rewriting like everything? Like I had this thing in back of my head. It's like, why are we rewriting everything? I agree that we should be, but like, why? Like, who is giving us like the permission to like rewrite all of these apps? So like, I love to kind of chat with you a bit about that too, because that is always an interesting conversation. Is like, when is it the right time to build something new versus rewrite something, right? Like, I'd love to get your
Yeah,
thoughts,
yeah.
like especially when you're talking about, do I just go to the next version of this technology? Do I look at other technologies?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tough question. For our part, we mostly built new things in .NET and
Yep.
then, maintain the classic ASP stuff. Um, Joel Spolsky had written an article that was very influential about like, never do a full rewrite. And
Yep.
usually the benefits are not there. But I think there's something to be said about like, except when there's a generational change in software, right? Like when a completely new paradigm comes out and the old one that you're on is going to be relegated to the dustbins of history,
Yeah.
then it may be time to consider it because like, are you going to be able to hire people
Yeah.
in the old stack? These are real considerations that you have to factor in. I worked, after that, the company where I did the classic ASP and then we went into .NET. After that, I went to Univision for a little while, the Spanish language television.
Sure.
And we were doing .NET, but I also had to maintain a system that was written in a proprietary Fortran, and
Mm.
we were upgrading the Fortran to a more modern Fortran, which
Sure.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
feels like a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like Fortran, it was a proprietary Fortran variant that we were trying to convert to Fortran 90, and it was running these mini computers, and I was like, yeah, you can't pay me enough to keep doing this. Like, I don't want to spend my time writing
It's
Fortran,
funny.
right?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because last time I checked, and which was a couple of years ago now, so I'll mention that the number one highest paid technology job out there is a COBOL developer.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at is that you have to pay COBOL developers a lot because there's so few of them,
Yep.
but there's a crap ton of software running COBOL
Hmm.
today
Yeah.
that people don't realize. Like, it's sort of like you might be scared if you realize how much of the world is running on COBOL, right? But
Yeah.
how few people still know it or want to work in it.
Yeah. I worked with a guy who I guess was a thought leader in some mainframe technology, some IBM thing. And I remember he said that 25 to 30% of his job was getting like answering emails from people because he was like one of four people on the planet who was still working in this technology. So like people would reach out to him all the time asking for help. And asked him like, so what happens when you retire? He's like, well, then there'll be three people. And I'm just like, like I could not imagine like that weight of like, you've been building something for 35, 40 years. And then, I knew people that graduated from college, they got a job and they were told like day one, oh, like 40% of your job is maintaining these old mainframe apps. And like
Yeah.
you don't learn mainframe apps in college anymore. There's no code camps to learn mainframe. So literally it's all like, okay, so I just look, I don't even know if there's like good like YouTube videos for learning COBOL or Fortran, right?
Right, right. What'll be interesting to me, like, and the reason they're still around is like the value proposition of rewriting it
Yeah.
compared to like, hey, it's working, we're still profitable, and can we afford to do this massive effort and possibly get it wrong, and impact the business? Like, I get it. Like
Yeah.
that's not something that's easy to justify. But it'll be interesting to see if like the continued rising costs and the fact that no one's doing it
Yeah.
will factor that in. But I also imagine that now that there's generative AIs getting so much better at writing code, you can imagine someone saying, "Well, let's just point GPT-4 at this COBOL code base
Yeah.
and see if we can't translate it to a more modern language."
Yeah.
And be interesting because I've been using GPT here and there, and like sometimes it does great, sometimes it
Yeah.
doesn't. But I imagine it could do really well with an existing code base, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's quite clear that the models are not like 100% like the same up to date as you are right now when you're asking the prompt, right? Like it's very clear. Sometimes like if you're asking a question on a newer technology, it kind of has a hard time, right? Which is
hmm
expected because I think the last model is like from September of last year or something like that. So like it makes sense. And I think one of the things I think people struggle with, and this is to go off on a tangent, is that people expect it to be Google, but AI powered Google, right? Which it's
right, right.
not, right? And I think that's what's really challenging for some folks. They expect to have like the answer to every question with 100% certainty. Um,
hmm
One of the things that I also, you mentioned something too, is like, we talk about technologies that are kind of like more mature that don't get used as much. I think of like C++ too. Like the amount of like companies that have to make the decision of like, oh, we have some C++ services that have like 15 wrappers on top of them because it doesn't make sense to update that C++ code. So
hmm
I guess my question to you around that is like, when you're making a technology choice, do you need to think about like future proofing the stack that you're deciding to build on?
Yeah, I think to some degree, but it depends on where you are, right? Like if you're at a very safe, steady enterprise, um, you know, that's probably something you want to consider. Like I am firmly in the camp of, tried and true is really important, but
Mm-hmm.
modern tried and true, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't jump on the latest greatest of anything that's not yet proven. Like I know a lot of people have jumped onto a lot of different variants of databases, and some have been
Yeah.
great,
Yeah.
some have not been. But the old RDBMSs, like those are tried and true, and we're using Postgres, and like
Yeah.
can't go wrong with Postgres. It's worked really great for us.
I had
But
somebody. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, but like when you're a startup, for example, your number one priority is product market fit, and
Yep.
uh, you know, we have a saying right now, like, because we're trying to grow customers and trying to build, and some of the things that engineering at a startup, it's so different from my experience at GitHub and Microsoft because GitHub and Microsoft well established, especially Microsoft because we're building platforms that other
Sure.
developers are building on.
Yeah.
Uh, and so you make a breaking change and that affects millions of developers, right? Or you know you get an API wrong and millions of developers are angry at you.
Yeah.
But when you're a startup and you're building your product, we have this saying that we've been repeating to ourselves as we go through prioritization every time is some of the things we want to do, those are things for companies to survive, right?
Yeah.
Like if we don't survive, it doesn't
The goal is
matter if
survival.
like
Yeah.
this code is factored perfectly,
Yeah.
or if we, have this engineered precisely the way we want. Sometimes we, or a lot of times we have to take a lot of shortcuts because we need to
Sure.
get, we're testing ideas, we're experimenting. We're not like, we don't know exactly what to build, and we don't know that people will like it until we've built it. So
Yeah. You
it's
don't have
it's
an
a
R and
it's
D
a real
budget, right?
paradigm change for me.
Yeah, like you don't have an R&D budget. Your R&D is very much just like throw it out there, and if the market reacts to it positively or negatively, that's your R&D, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
you're able to
And
experiment in some worlds, but like every, to quote somebody, like every keystroke is one less keystroke than you have, right? Like that whole
yeah.
thing. And I think that's
Yeah,
very,
and it's
very,
not like
like,
we're not
good.
talking, we're talking to customers. We're doing a little upfront, kind of validation of ideas. But even then, like, things we've built that we thought would really knock their socks off, it just, we get crickets. So,
Yeah.
um, that's been, that's probably the biggest challenge right now that we're facing. So my current company, we started 3 years ago, and like right in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we started off as a chat ops company, so kind of building on our experience of Hubot, which was the bot that we used to use at GitHub. And I think, one of the lessons I probably learned is that I think GitHub was a very special company in that, like, GitHub, the way we did things at GitHub, I thought were a lot of the things were amazing, but like not replicable at other companies. Just the culture is so different at other companies. Like GitHub was a company because it was distributed to its core. It was very much a company that put that first and foremost in terms of things like, we would write things down and not just rely on, oral history.
Sure.
We would
Yeah.
use a bot in chat to automate so many tasks. Like we deploy software using the bot. We get all our graphs into chat using the bot. And we thought, oh, we can make a version of this that will, other companies will like love to use. And so we did, and we found that, we just didn't get traction.
Yeah.
And one of the key things is like when you ask the question, what problem do you solve? Well, what problems do you have is not a compelling answer. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
we decided to focus on a specific problem, and we got into um, the customer success space because we noticed like a lot of our customers were being in it. We're starting to use Slack shared channels with their customers to provide support, and they're having trouble managing those conversations. So we were like, well, we built this platform. Maybe we can build a product to solve that problem on top of our platform. So, which may have been a benefit of having built the platform first, but in general, I'd say build the product first, and then if you can
Yeah.
extract the platform out of that, that's great.
Yeah, I think that's a very thoughtful way to go about like how you put together a business and make and think about how what sort of technology decisions you need to make for that business, right? Like if you're in the business of, oh, we know this because we were at once customers of this. Like at the end of the day, like you were customers using Slack, using other tools like of some other person's development to make your work streams more efficient. And to backtrack a little bit about making technology choices around career, like you said something that I found very interesting about like the relational database systems, right? Like tried and true, whatever. And I come from I think a similar background as you, where whenever I look at a data structure, I think of it like, oh, like that's I can think of that as a relational database, even if relational database isn't the right data structure for that job, right? So
Mhm.
I guess a question that I'd love to ask you is like when you're in this space where you know your opinions on like what technology should fit for some particular business problem doesn't exactly align. Like you look, for instance, you might look at some of the data that you're generating from some like a chatbot or some other mechanism. Like it probably isn't relational, right? Or it's not
Mhm.
all relational. It might be a graph. It might be something else, right? Like how are you able to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, I know the technology that I know and love isn't the right fit for this practical implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I feel like most round pegs you can slam into a square peg,
Sure,
right?
sure.
A
Yeah,
square
sure.
hole,
Of
but
course you can. Of
um,
course you can.
like honestly, I haven't really run into too many cases where I'm like, oh, the technology we're using is absolutely the wrong fit. There've
Mm,
been a couple times though, like so we started building this new feature called playbooks, and the idea is that customer success teams often have a lot of like kind of written down or like traditional playbooks. Oh, when a new customer shows up, these are the 10 things we need to do, right? And so we're building this feature in to automate that, and it's somewhat like a workflow engine. Now, historically, and that requires a lot of interactivity in the browser. And historically, the way we would do that is we would, like we're very much, or at least like philosophically bent, like I embrace the web and web technology. So like, and progressive enhancement. And so we would take an approach that was very similar to what, GitHub did, right? Like we would use web components and turbo links, a style of updating a site, right? So what some people might call update panel, but that's not really a
Sure.
fair
Yeah.
comparison.
Sure.
But and so we started using Turbo and Stimulus all over our site to add more interactivity. And so rather than sending JSON and having it all client rendered, we would send HTML, but only update the specific pockets that need to be updated, that sort of thing. But when we started building this playbook engine, it was extremely, interactive with drag and drop and all that. And we realized like, okay, our normal approach, it can be done, but it's not going to be optimal. And so we decided to use React. And this is my first time ever doing anything in React. So,
Sure.
I had to factor that in, like, oh, I need to come up to speed in React
Hmm.
really, really fast so
Yeah.
that I can build this. Fortunately, Keith had a lot of experience in React. And Ashley, who I work with, is just brilliant. So she learned it very fast as well. And so now, I'd say um, all three of us feel comfortable in React now.
Yeah.
And we built this feature, and I absolutely think it was the right choice to use React for this particular feature. I wouldn't have built our entire site in React because most
Sure.
of our site is content,
Yep.
not an app. But in cases where it really isn't like an application like Google Sheets, that
Hmm.
sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think I've come to see the light about why people are really into React and
Yeah.
the composability of it. Like I was actually really impressed with how composable React is and how reusable and composable the components I was writing were. And it really helped me, oh, I can focus on just this component right now. And if I follow the general React principles, it's going to just work with everything else I've done. And I don't have to like change 20 other things to add this one thing in. And that was a real eye opener in that and impressed me about React.
Yeah, and this is another thing that I love talking about too. It's like when you find a new technology that I guess could maybe compete with your tried and true the technology that you love, right? I think it's fair to say like you love .NET, you love C Sharp, but you're able to recognize like, hey, React solves a particular problem really, really well. Like I wouldn't use it
Mhm.
for everything, like you're saying. And this kind of goes back to, I've talked to a lot of folks on this podcast, and a lot of folks are curious by nature, right? And I think one of the things that's very interesting about technology folks and being curious is this idea of like wanting to try new things all the time. Do you see yourself like, for instance, like having to play around with React or learning something else, like in it, maybe in a new business domain, even where
Mhm.
you're genuinely curious and that drives you to want to learn more, or are you more practical in the I need a very solid reason as to try something new?
I would say I'm more when it's when it's my business I'm working on, I'm a little bit more on the latter side, and mainly because I know I will build things faster in something tried and true. Like when we were first thinking about building this product, we were applying to Y Combinator as well.
Hmm.
And we look at like the landscape of all the companies applying to Y Combinator, and they're all like Go, Node, you know,
Yeah.
um, other
Yeah.
technologies, right?
Yeah.
Not a lot of .NET companies are in there. And we did have the moment of, okay, well, we have to consider how we're going to hire developers. Like, can we hire, there's a crap ton of Node developers out there,
Sure.
and should we consider Node? Should we consider Go? And in the end, I was like, well, the tech that I'm most comfortable, and I'm curious about those things for sure. I've done a little bit of Node, but I was like, I'm personally am going to be faster in C# and
Sure.
ASP.NET.
Yeah.
ASP.NET Core has come a long way as a viable platform for building a startup. And I'm going to be able to evaluate the code of people writing this much better. So we decided, yeah, we'll just stick with what I know. And, that was a case where I could have been more curious and said, well, I want to learn something new. But, like if I can't build, the product in that quickly enough, that'd be a problem. But on the other hand, like there are times where like something new comes along that you can see the value to the product. So,
Yeah.
LLMs is a really good example.
Sure.
When GPT came out, it was like, okay, I better dive into this and play
Yeah.
around with it. And so we added, a little bit in our product, but we try to do it in a subdued and useful way, and not just like, like throw it everywhere. And
Everything's a nail when you're a hammer. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. And so, that's a case where I felt like, here's a case if we're not curious, we're just going to get left behind,
Yeah.
right? And so, and React is a good example of that. Like I was in terms of like how, the hype around React, I'm very late to the party.
Sure.
But on one level, that's kind of good because that means all the problems that the early adopters had and figured out, I didn't have to run into, right? Like,
Yeah.
and there's tons of great documentation out there. And so I was able to, build this feature really quickly because of that. I didn't run into any like, early adopter bugs or this or that. So yeah, I think it's good to be curious. But I try to be curious in my own time
Yeah.
is a good way to say that.
Yeah, I think that's also smart too. Also, full disclosure, I think that the technology that you have taken as like your primary tool, it's a technology that it what like you said, tried and true, but also like has kind of spanned the scope of time. I imagine that if you like were a Perl developer, and not to knock people that build on Perl, or if you're a Lisp developer, like those are very specific technologies for specific tasks, right? It's
Hmm.
not more utility like .NET is, or even like JavaScript. If you include all the different ways you can build JavaScript apps, right? So I think
Hmm.
that you had a leg up, where else other people are like, oh, I can't build everything in Scheme, so I need to
Right,
like
right.
learn other languages, right? One thing too that I would love to get your thoughts on, obviously, we talked a little bit about like making technology choices for like new businesses, but you've also had the opportunity to work in larger organizations where technology decisions, I, I'm just going to say this frankly, takes a little bit longer than
Hmm.
maybe working in a startup. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as to like, not to directly compare the two, but like what are some of the similarities of working, inside of a smaller team that you've built yourself with people that like handpicked to an extent, versus a larger organization that has lots of outlying tentacles and different things that need to be accounted for.
Yeah, I mean,
And you
I
could be
think
as
that,
and you could be as honest, or even say I don't want to answer that. Like that's cool too.
yeah, I mean, I think obviously when you're in a big company, like there's the institutional momentum that will affect things, right? Like this is the way we've done it. This is the way we're going to do it. And like for example, at Microsoft, the fact that we use C#, like there's a strategic reason why we would use
Sure.
C# too, right? Like that is the product we, you know, are putting out. It's why, like you mentioned, like ASP.NET MVC is not only the thing I already knew, but also like I worked on it, and so
Mhm.
I know the people who work on it. So
Yeah.
if something comes up, I that was a strategic advantage. Um, I remember when I was near the end of my time at uh, Microsoft, I wanted to start doing more things on GitHub. And at that time, like we had Microsoft had a Team Foundation server, but or they had a what was it called, Coplex, you know.
Yep. Yep.
And so that was Coplex is its own thing, but I was seeing that like, well, where, if we want to appeal to the open source audience outside of and grow our community, where's everyone who's doing open source going? Well, they're going to GitHub. And so I tried to put, more and more of I initially put some of our docs on GitHub for NuGet. And that ran into some resistance, because there's people who have, their territory and they want to defend their territory,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
they want to have the big company be aligned, which I think, is not a bad thing that the company be aligned, but sometimes, you have to kind of push out into a new territory to realize that the company could expand and become better, right? When I was working on MVC, we were doing this. Our initial pre-releases were this sort of like shared source type of thing. It
Yep.
wasn't quite open source, but we were letting you look at the source code. And, like one of the things I started pushing for was like, can we just license it under a proper open source license? And this is like around the time when Balmer had just said that
Sure.
like Linux is a cancer.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So, but like Guthrie was like totally on board and kind of ahead of me on this. Like he had already been talking to people by the time I, you know, gathered the courage to ask him if we could do it. So like I think I forgot where I was going with this.
Sure. Sure.
But yeah, like, you run into that a lot more at a big company than you do at a small company, right?
Yeah.
And and when it's your company, like I think, there's the challenge of not imposing your will too much and being open to new ideas and all that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not trying to kind of over summarize it by comparing it to like a political affiliation, but if you work at a large company, there is an extent where like, oh, you're a conservative, you're a progressive, you do the company thing, you do the thing. But when you're, and this is not to be offensive in any way, but when you run your own company, you can kind of be the dictator to an
Hmm.
extent, right? You like you have the ability to craft the narrative and craft the, I guess you can say, culture, quote unquote, that you want to have, right? And I
Hmm.
mean, I think it's well documented that the things that you did and the things that the folks that you're working with in that particular time in .NET world um, changed how a lot of the greater company, Microsoft, did a lot of things, especially when interfacing with developers, which I think is only for the good. And I don't want to talk about how amazing you are because you already know that. But I think one of the things that's, as somebody who does, I speak at conferences and I do like a little bit of history of web development. So I have a history of web development talk, and we talk a little bit about MVC. And you mentioned Codeplex and transition to GitHub. What was it about GitHub specifically? Obviously, you ended up working there. What was it about GitHub specifically that drew you in or made you more curious? Because, like you said, there were alternatives that existed of like, oh, you want to see some source code? Here's some source code. You want to contribute in some way? You can do that. Like, what was it about GitHub specifically that really lured you in?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's really interesting because at that time, GitHub was a pain to use excuse me, on Windows. And so, but when you would
As is
go to
most non-Windows technology. What I found out,
yeah,
if it's like not built for Windows, it usually runs not very well on Windows. But I
yeah.
interrupted, so keep going.
Oh, it's okay. It made me think like, if I think a lot of, especially younger developers, like, now live in a world where Microsoft owns GitHub and it feels like, oh yeah, this is a natural fit.
Mm-hmm.
But, you go back 10, 20 years, well, GitHub's only been around, what, maybe 12, 15 years. But, you go back around the early days and nobody would ever predict that would happen, right?
Sure.
It but two things primarily appealed to me about GitHub, or maybe let's say three things. One, quite honestly, the design, like the aesthetic. When I go to the site, just things, you go to SourceForge and it's just plastered with ads and it's just like
Yep.
very clunky, right? Codeplex a little bit better, but GitHub just felt smooth. It felt like butter, for the like I and that was an intentional thing. One of the when I interviewed that there, one of the things that they really drilled into us is that we try to hire developers with good taste, and it's very subjective, but it's something that they wanted to really emphasize. Also, the ratio of designers to developers was really high, and when I
Mm-hmm.
learned what it was, I think it was I can't remember the exact number, like, but like 1 to 3 or something like that. And I just remember, like, do we even have a designer? Oh yeah, we do have a designer who's serving a team of like 40 engineers or something like that when I was at Microsoft, right? And
Yeah.
it was just difficult to get, dedicated design time. But the ratio of designers to developers was very high. And it's not just the aesthetic, but that meant that the user experience, the UX was really, really good, right? It's very thoughtful. And it had to be because Git was not usable
Not very
at
friendly.
the
Yeah.
time, right? Um, so that was one of the things that attracted me. Two, I really like that and I think this was a real genius move on their part, is that they put the user first rather than the project first, right? Like every
Mm.
other site you went to, you would go to the project site.
Yep.
But GitHub, it's always like /username/repo, right?
Yep.
And so that created a really interesting dynamic of, like, people would say, hey, come check out my repo. And so it had a viral nature to that, right? They
Sure.
they were incentivized to get people to go to their site, and then where do you end up? You're on GitHub. And three, that I think helped lead to the massive community that they had, and a community of GitHub would use the term. I don't think they originated, but super fans, right?
Hmm.
So they would have just people who absolutely loved GitHub.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, so when every release we would put out of MVC or NuGet, we get a lot of like positive feedback, but we'd always get a lot of like anger too, no matter what
Yeah.
we did, right? It's just,
Sure.
as a big audience,
Yeah.
you get some haters, you get some lovers. But I remember my first release at GitHub. I just remember, like, okay, gotta steel yourself for, like, the negative. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you get 1,000 good comments. That one negative one,
It's the one.
kind
Yeah.
of sticks you a little. And so it's like, okay, prepare yourself for the negative comments. And I just remember it just being all love, just like love, 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 love. And I was like, what the heck is happening here?
Sure.
And it was just, it was the power of the brand, right? The power of GitHub, the power of the Octocat.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite fascinating, and I mean, and I equate it to, and this isn't really fair, but it's very much like a social network for developers, right? And I think
Hmm.
that it's used in that way because it does come with the good of social networks, like the great community around it, the obviously the amplification of stuff, but it also comes with the negatives, right? Like everybody who uses social media knows that there are not great people, right?
Yeah.
One thing that's also interesting that you brought up that I think of is like an extra wrinkle that makes GitHub very viral, like you said, but also introduces new, I guess, opportunities that are interesting is like everything is based on a profile. So in the situation where somebody or an individual wants to no longer maintain that project, or even something worse, like maybe that person passes away, like the transfer of IP or the transfer of stuff is very interesting. And I know there's great levers there now, but I always am like, oh, so I go to some, like, if I'm consuming some open source repository, I'm like some random person that has hundreds of millions of views on their GitHub profile or their GitHub repos. They get thousands of downloads on NuGet a week or a day or whatever. And it seems like there's a lot of pressure on the open source developer using that approach. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are a lot of entitled people out there, and it is
Sure.
tough to be an open source maintainer. And that can be a bit of a drawback of having it be attached to your profile. I mean, now you
Yeah.
can put it in an org and
Yep.
sort of detach yourself from it. But the nice thing is, let's say you do want to abandon it and someone else wants to take it on, like they can just fork it and
Yep.
continue on. And, you know, um, takes a little bit of communication and say, hey, this is now over here. And like ideally, if you talk to the person who had the old one and say, hey, like I want to continue this, can you put a note in the README to point to mine now? Um, I actually did this with, so there used to be this library, ASP.NET client validation, that added so ASP.MVC had client validation that was done through jQuery and jQuery validation.
Hmm.
And it's all driven by, metadata attributes on your models and all that. But, at some point, like JavaScript itself advanced so much that a lot of people feel like, well, I don't really need jQuery. I don't want to add this extra library, but I still want that validation to work driven off the metadata. And someone out there had written a library to do that. Like it was basically client validation without jQuery. But they stopped, and I started using it, and I was like, oh, this is pretty nice. But they stopped maintaining it.
Sure. Yeah.
So I just, I was like, oh, well, I have these bugs I found. I just forked it and started improving it, and I published it to NPM. And so now I find myself the maintainer of this client validation library.
Yeah.
It's not super popular, so I don't feel the stress or pressure. Like I used to run a more popular open source project called Subtext way back in the day.
Yep.
I felt a lot more pressure working on that. Like
Sure.
that one, like put a strain on my family because I would work
Yeah.
on it every weekend, every day. But this one is more like, it does the job. Occasionally there's a bug, but I push real hard for people to try to submit a pull request. And then, it doesn't take too much of my time to maintain it. And it helps a lot that I'm actively using it in our product.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting, like this whole dichotomy of like you obviously love building software, like that's the thing that's very clear if you look at your career, but at some point in time, like software building only goes so far, and then like you got to make the money, right?
Hmm.
So I'm always very I look at people and I have some envy for folks that are able to have like a career like building like open source technology, but then you have a conversation with them and they talk about like, well, the money's not that great unless you work for a big company whose sole job it is to downstream contribute to something. And
Right.
and one thing that as we transition a little bit, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the stuff that you're doing at Abbot is like, the decision to choose making a technology choice and building that technology yourself, or looking if there's something that exists out in the market already that you can leverage. Because I
Mm,
think one thing that's very, very clear is that, whatever the latest numbers are, 99% of all apps use some form of open source software, right? That's probably an exaggerated number, but my point still stands. Like, so
right.
when you're building something new at Abbot, how often is it there has to be something out here that already exists, let's use that, versus I know exactly what I need to build and you just build it? Is it a little bit of a balance or is it you sway one way to the other?
Oh, I mean, it's a bit of a balance, but I sway, excuse me, heavily. I should not be drinking a carbonated drink right now. I heavily sway towards like, okay, can we find a package or a library that does it, right? And I think, it's often not like oh, I need a full app. It's more like, okay, I just need a library or package that can do it.
Yeah.
And that's if I had a wish list for GPT, it would be like when I ask it to write some code, if it knows of a library that can do that, that would be great, right? But a lot of times we're able to, the challenge with a library obviously is, okay, it's yet another dependency to maintain, and it's something that, there's a bit of a learning curve. And sometimes, what you end up finding is you need a mishmash of the two. So a good example of that is we wanted to build a Markdown, and by Markdown I mean MRKDWN, which is Slack's variant of Markdown, which is
Mm-hmm.
not the same as Markdown, and
Yeah.
well, pain in the ass. But we wanted an editor that you could do on the website, but that would honor their format. And
Sure.
so because it's not that popular of a format and most people would just compose their things in Slack, there's not I could not find really good
Sure.
markdown editor, however you want to call it. But what I did find was or actually I didn't find it. I actually found this. It's called TipTap, I think, or it's almost like a library for building editors. And so we started using that. So we didn't have to build an editor from scratch, but we did have to put together this thing to support the format that we wanted to format. Actually, and I think I just learned that they raised a round of funding. So it's an open source project, but I think they have some commercial extensions that they're trying to sell, which seems to be a common model for open source projects trying to make a little money is, have the core product be open source, but then sell paid extensions. We use Hangfire, for example, for scheduling tasks, and they have like paid extensions as well.
That's interesting. I mean, I love the idea of, not reinventing the wheel, because I think us as technologists, we're very guilty of like reinventing the wheel. But also, there are some times where it's just like, it's going to take me maybe a day to build this, and all the other alternatives aren't going to work for my exact use case, or they're part of something that is way too big. I see developers
Right.
do this all the time where they'll grab some NPM or some NuGet package because they need like one little extension
Hmm.
instead of like just building that extension. Especially if the code's like on GitHub, like you could just like borrow that code, right? Instead of
Yeah, that's
like,
often what I'll do is I'll if it's like a big package, but I just need one aspect, I'll go look at the GitHub repo and then copy the file in, keep the copyright. You know,
mhm,
I'm big about honoring the
yep,
copyright and the license, but yeah, and then put them in, list them in our credits page.
yeah, that's awesome. I mean, especially giving, taking a like just the 1 second to just acknowledge the fact that like, hey, like somebody else built this and they should call it out. Like I think that's awesome, and I highly encourage if you're building technology ever, like to have some sort of open source credits page somewhere in your software, because like I said, more than likely you are using something. You might not know it because it's downstream to something else, but at least call it out.
Yeah, I remember I wrote so early Nougat what had a PowerShell extension in Visual Studio that you could actually have like Nougat packages install PowerShell scripts. I
Mm-hmm.
think I kind of hope that's gone by now, but but I had written a PowerShell script that in Nougat that would list all the Nougat packages that you're using so that you could build the credits page.
Yeah.
Uh, there's probably better solutions now, but I don't. I should look into
There might
that.
be something built into GitHub even. Like I know GitHub has like all these dependency validators, right? To like make sure that you're
That's
using the
right,
latest
right.
version. There's probably somebody probably wrote some GitHub action that like dumps out like I know they can for like release notes you can already get those generated, but maybe there's
Yeah.
one for like, oh, these are the softwares that I'm taking advantage of or using in my system.
Right.
Um
Which works great for packages, but if you copy and paste the source file
yeah.
in, we need a way of identifying it and calling those out too. So
Yeah.
I
That sounds
usually
like
like
something
in
an
the
LLM
comments
can
I'll do
fix, right?
credit colon so I can
Yeah.
just search that. But yeah,
Yeah, that's something like an LLM I think could be very valuable in doing, especially like,
right.
for instance, GitHub Copilot, like has access to all these open source repositories, right? These public repos. It would be very trivial probably for it to just say, oh, like, is this code used somewhere else? And basically let the person know, do you want to give credit to this person because you're using code that is theirs? Then you kind of run into an interesting conversation where it's like, oh, like, this person wrote the exact same code that I did. That's kind of cool.
Hmm.
But that's probably something that I don't know. Maybe somebody's already working on building. One thing, as we wrap up, I want to talk more about Abbott specifically because I think specifically like in the chat op space, like there are a handful of industries that like oh like we definitely need when I think of bots. My opinion, and this isn't fair, is usually like okay, I'm talking to a bot now. And
Hmm.
I'd kind of love to get your thoughts as to like when that opinion is misconstrued a little bit and why Abbott solves a particular problem that is better than just some random bot that's on some website for customer service or what have you.
Yeah, yeah. So our approach with bots is not we're avoiding the you're talking to a bot right now, and we're
Yeah.
taking we really like the Copilot approach, right? Where
Yep.
the bot it needs to be an assistant to the people working, and not replacing the people that are working at the moment, because people will know pretty quickly they're talking to a bot, and they'll get
Mm-hmm.
frustrated by that, or the bot
Yep.
will do hallucinate something that would be very bad. Can I show you what I'm working
Yeah,
on?
sure. Yeah, I'm gonna pull up your screen share right now. All right, so
Okay,
people
so
can
you're sharing,
see.
right?
Yeah, so localhost 4979.
Yeah, so this is my local dev environment because I want to show our customer stuff. But in Slack, when a customer like says something, we'll start a conversation. So each thread is a conversation. And the thing here, there's a lot going on here, and I'll kind of walk through each thing. But So here's the original message, right? Like, I'm not able to reach the website. We'll use AI to summarize, but most importantly, we'll have an sort of AI to generate an outcome or a conclusion. And so when I, as a support person, if I want to know more, I can look at this. This is summarizing the entire interaction, which might be multiple messages.
Sure.
But this, I can just scan these too to see what do I need to do. Oh, I can close this because it's been resolved. Great, I'll do that. At some point, we can even automatically do that. But at no point is my customer talking to a bot. It's just more the bot is helping me figure out, okay, what's going on. So here's an example where, this person does this weird message, and I might not understand the cultural reference, but it was really interesting that GPT does. It's like, oh, they're just starting with a playful line from the movie The Princess Bride. That's the AI summarizing that.
Yep.
And I love that about that because, like, if I'm, if someone's coming from a different background than me and says something and I just don't understand, like, what they're saying, like, the fact that GPT was able to kind of explain it to me is helpful. And here it's saying, I need to wait for more information from the customer, that sort of thing. That's kind of the how we're trying to leverage AI and or large language models to be an assistant to the customer success person rather than having it be directly in the path.
Yeah.
And you can also see we're doing some categorization out of AI generated tagging. You can also add your own tags.
Okay.
And we can generate. We can also handle events in response to these tags. This is really interesting. So you can see that sometimes like it gets it wrong, right? Like I should probably make sure it's always lowercase the tags or something like that. But it just but it got the job done. It's telling me the negative sentiment. That's one area where like the bot and this is all running in Slack. The other thing we're doing these days, this is kind of a sneak peek of what I've been working on is what we're calling playbooks. So let me find an interesting one. So,
and while you're pulling it up, do you mind if I ask you just a general question or make a comment about what you just showed? One thing so I love the fact that you're going down the approach of this is something that assists you versus something that replaces you. Because I think one of the big, I guess, knocks on Chat GPT or GPT-4 or Copilots is like, oh, this is going to replace me. When in all honesty, like a practical implementation of something to help you get closer to your answer, but still expecting you to make the decision yourself is really important, right? Like the fact that it adds context on top of that is really, really cool. And I would love to kind of get your thoughts as to like, because there is this weird, I guess, inflection point you need to make where it's like, how much does the AI do for me? So like, what are some of the things that when you were looking to implement something like this, that you were like, oh, I could like have the AI like do like 4 steps forward, like I open a ticket and then tag the ticket and then assign the ticket, do all these things, right? But then you're taking the user out of the situation completely. So in your opinion, I'd like to get your thought, like what is the point where the person or the individual who is interacting with the bot need to actually do something?
Yeah, so our primary we're primarily focused on what we call human in the loop, and where for the most part we think the bots can do things to assist the agent, but we don't. Our customers are not going to trust our bot with their customers. Yeah. However, there's some scenarios where we're experimenting with allowing that, where we have a high confidence that we can do the right thing. One of those examples is for a couple customers, we're training the bot on their documentation. And when we can detect that someone is asking for the documentation, we can have a response that points to the documentation, and then we can ask the question, like, was this helpful, or do you need to do more, right? That kind of thing. So that is maybe the one case where we're willing to experiment. Like our customers are experimenting with their customers of actually letting the bot automatically do a response. But for the most part, we're not doing that. Instead, like Abbot mentioned, this playbook feature. We can have So we have this concept of triggers, right? We can have a trigger where like when the AI has determined a negative sentiment, then this we'll look at the customer name, and then we'll do send a message, or we'll notify the first responder, things like that. And so we can build these playbooks that will automate a series of steps based on what's happening to the customer. But they're all they're all geared towards helping the agent better serve their customers.
Yeah.
Now, an agent could actually write a playbook now that directly responds to the customer if they want to. But that's sort of like that's on them. If they feel comfortable with it, you can do that now. This is our latest focus right now is building these playbooks because one of the things we're real big fans of is just the power of automation in general. And for the most part, automation takes writing a lot of code. But a lot of times the tasks that you want to do in Slack are pretty standard. They're pretty common tasks. And so we've been spending a lot of time on this where anyone can build playbooks. Like we have one, the inactivity one is kind of interesting where if it's a scheduled task, and if customer room has been inactive for 2 days, we'll notify the responders. So the responders are the people who are responsible for that customer. We'll say, hey, you might want to check in on your people, right? And so things like that where it will help customers manage or help our customers manage their customers is what we're focused on. And there's a lot of potential we think for AI to assist that, right? Like start to drive AI to analyze patterns of conversation, things like that. But I think for the most part, the most I would want to do in terms of like having the AI draft responses would be like suggested replies, right?
Sure.
So customer says something, AI thinks it can answer it. It proposes a response to the agent takes it in response, or clicks a button in response.
Yeah, this
That
is
I'm
the,
okay with.
yeah, this is the recommended response. Should I send it? Something like that, right? I think
Yeah,
some voice.
Yeah, because like LLMs right now, the way GPT work, like hallucinations are sort of a fundamental aspect of the way they work. So they're going to happen. And if you hallucinate a wrong answer, it's going to be frustrating for everybody. I mean, some situations down dangerous. So the idea that you would let your bot just like interact with your customer freely, I just don't see that happening anytime soon. So, but I've seen impressive results with it generating, like the draft of a response. You tweak it, correct it a little bit. That saved you a lot of time, and it's still, keeping you in the loop in terms of what's going on with your customers too. That's the other aspect. Like I kind of want to know what I'm telling my customers in the first place. So I wouldn't want the bot to just go to town and start telling my customers that they should try a different product.
Yeah.
Or maybe
Yeah, one thing that's very, very interesting about Playbook specifically, seeing this the first time, is like, this is a completely different way to build stuff too. Like, I don't know if you would categorize this as a low code or no code platform or what have you, but like the idea that like you can build these workflows without having to know a particular programming language, know the underlying SDKs, all that sort of stuff. So, and that's a whole other conversation that I think I'd love to have with you at some point in the future about, using these sort of frameworks instead of building apps yourself, right? I think, from your perspective, I'd love to get your thought. When you were scoping out the idea for playbooks, was it because you knew that the end user is going to have to, I guess, define workflows, and having a developer, quote unquote, like in the process would slow down iteration?
Yeah, so we knew that playbooks are a very common theme among customer success teams,
Yep.
and they're often oral tradition or written down in 3 different places, on what to do, and people have to remember to like move to the next step. And we thought, well, we want customer success people to use this directly, and they're not necessarily going to be programmers. So we thought that because to be originally, if we go back to what we originally built, it was a chat ops platform. And so you could write these automations using 3 different languages: C Sharp, Python, and JavaScript. And that's still in our system. It's we call them skills. So you can still write automation in those languages. And what we found is that our customers just weren't interested in spending time to do that, right? It's a lot of learning. It is a bit high learning curve, and it's a lot of work. And with our playbook engine, a lot of the things they want to do, it's pretty, like just drag and drop, reorder these things. So, and by the way, this is the thing I mentioned, like, oh, this is why I had to learn React, so that we can
Sure. You had to build UI cards, right? Like that's a React 101.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interactivity in this sort of workflow engine. So, I had a lot of fun working on this. But yeah, this, like, we're building playbooks for ourselves to use, and I'd rather do it this way than write a bunch of code in C# in the browser. So, and I think one of the things we can do is we can actually wait. Do I have a wait? We can actually call our skills. Do I have that yet? Oh yeah, run the skill on the channel. So if I want to run a skill over here, we have actual, skills.
Different skills you built. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and so here I'll hit Command N, and you can see here, like, now, like, if there's a step that there's no step that does what I want, I get see that I get IntelliSense.
Yeah.
So we're using what are we using for this? My brain's blanking here.
No worries.
Really great library. And I'm gonna remember it when we're done talking. But
no worries.
I love it. It's based off of CodeMirror.
Okay.
And SharpMirror or Mirror Sharp. That's it. So shout out to, I think his name's Andre, but really great library if you want to build an editor that uses IntelliSense and C# in a browser.
That's awesome. This is great. Was there anything else that you wanted to show, like, for minutes of new things that are being built out or things that you'd like to share? Otherwise, we can just kind of hop back.
The one other thing, like,
show your
when you're running a startup or any kind of product, having insights into what's going on is so important. And so this is one of the things, I mentioned product market fit is key. So, like, this is the type of thing that gets neglected until we start to run into production problems. And, like, a big part of your product is it being up for your customers. So, this is like we're using Grafana on Azure. Mm-hmm. And so we have these really beautiful graphs. So you can see, like, just all sorts of things going on in here. I think you can see we have these event spikes that we've been trying to figure out, like, okay, now that we have these spikes, can we handle them more gracefully? Because sometimes they're, causing issues for us. We have a lot of different interesting graphs. I think one of the challenges now is, we have a lot of graphs, but can we turn it into knowledge? Can we actually help make decisions based on that? And this is another area where I'd love to see more LLM usage. Yeah, because I think this is an area where it is good at identifying patterns. And so it'd be great for that to be integrated into this and be able to say, hey, it looks like, you're running into problems with XYZ, you should try restarting the server every hour or something.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Things like, I'm a bit of an observability nerd, and looking at, some of the things that, like, in the anomaly detection space, like you're talking about, like having AI basically, like, show you the problem, show you what happens during the user flow or the cohort for that particular problem, and then identifying what the potential cause could be. Like, those are all things that, from a developer perspective or from a founder perspective, in your case, like, immediate business value return. Because if you see if you have issues, AI can get you, like, all the way there, and then you can make a decision with all the context as to what makes the most sense for you and your business without having to do all the research yourself.
Yeah. And I know, like, there are teams within Microsoft who are building those type of tools for their own, for Azure, right? Like, so that Azure itself can self-diagnose problems and recover and that sort of thing. But I'd love to see that kind of thing out there, for a small little startups trying to
Sure.
keep our site up and
Yeah.
running, in the light of like weird spikes in traffic and things like that.
Yeah.
But I, this is one of those aspects of like building a small app that it is hard to know what's going on in your
Mm-hmm.
product. So like getting good at observability and logging and telemetry is really important. So I've been really pleased with the new features of ASP.NET Core towards that end, like the new APIs for telemetry and using open telemetry.
Mm-hmm.
And just, I think you and I were talking earlier, like just recently, App Insights now supports that. So, which is great. Like we're using App Insights primarily because we have a lot of Azure credits.
Sure.
But now that they've added open telemetry support, it's actually, and we have the Grafana dashboard, it's actually been really, it's starting to really come together where we can really start to understand what's happening on our site live as it happens, and that's helped a lot in sort of identifying production issues that we encounter. Most of the time the production issues are related to something you just deployed, but this one that we're like trying to figure out now that it's been periodically happening does not appear related to anything we've deployed recently. So that's where good metrics comes in real handy, because it sometimes it's just something that as your app gets more and more popular, you start to hit a point where, like, let's say memory usage and GC collections start to crash the site, whereas before they didn't, because you just weren't getting enough traffic for you to hit that threshold where it couldn't handle it anymore.
Yeah, one thing I just want to call out to folks too. So Phil and I were talking before we got started, and out of all the things Phil has done in his entire career, he is most proud of that dashboard. I just want folks to be
Well, I didn't
100%
even build the dashboard. I think
aware.
Ashley did that. but
No, no,
as the leader, you take
yeah.
credit for all the things that everyone else does in the
Yeah, we
beginning.
can work. We can work on that a bit. That is a
Yeah.
not a strong leadership skill to have. So I'm going to switch off from sharing your screen.
Sure.
And I think one of the things that, as we wrap up, this has been a great conversation. I've really appreciated your thoughts on kind of moving through the technology landscape and working at small places, working at large places, and kind of stuff in the middle. Like I would think GitHub is kind of like an in the middle, right? And I think one thing that I've seen
When
or
I
heard,
joined, it was 50, but when I left, it was about
yeah,
8 or 900. So
yeah,
it ran the gamut from small. It was a great example of joining a hyper growth company, which is
yes,
yet another experience.
yeah. I think too, like, one of the things that I've, gathered from this is that, we're all trying to do a few similar things. We have some problem that we're trying to solve, and technology is that tool. Sometimes technology isn't the right tool. Sometimes, like you're showing with, Playbook, for instance, like sometimes it's just simple as getting the users like the right experience to be able to build that. Like obviously technology's behind the scenes there, but you don't need a developer. Or I think the bot slash ops space in general, it is very hyper dependent on efficiency. So when you're able
Hmm.
to add efficiency to whatever process, your developer lifecycle, your end user lifecycle, your end user management, customer success, you've mentioned a few times, you're only going to have positive results if you think about it as to what brings the optimal value. And I'd like to, as we
Hmm.
close, I'd like to get your thoughts. If what are some of the things that you've seen throughout your career, obviously, and the couple of different hats that you've worn, that regardless of the technology, regardless of the job, that have stayed kind of stable, or things that have been like, oh, I recognize this from this. It doesn't have to be technology, but I'd love to
Hmm.
get your thoughts on like what are some of the things that you've seen that aren't trends that have been around forever and probably will be forever.
Oh, I mean, a couple things come to mind, right? One is, the value of root cause analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, being able to get to ultimately what we do is problem solving, and being good at that is, that's timeless, I feel like. The other is more, moving one level up, is the value of like understanding how to align people to accomplish a task, right? I think, uh, there's a lot of popularization of the great genius who just, can do all this great work. But most great software, in fact, pretty much all great software is written by teams of people working together. And I think some of the principles of how you run a good team are timeless. And unfortunately, like not often well practiced. I think a lot of times managers, uh, they lose their way, right? Like they look at it as a power trip, or they're the one in charge, or this or that. And ultimately, you're trying to, you know, you're trying to align a group of people and remove obstacles from them and make them feel like they're part of a team in a safe environment so that they can produce something really great. And I think that to me, that's timeless. Like the best teams that I've ever seen have always felt like, like there's this great term, psychological safety, right? Like they feel like they can, uh, they're, they're not under the gun all the time. They don't have managers who are like trying to track their hours worked, who are really focused on removing obstacles and all that, and aren't so penny wise pound foolish.
Yeah.
Like I see like there's a lot of movement towards getting people back in the office at a lot of
Sure.
companies.
Yeah.
And I just like, and the motivation is because, well, we've already spent all this money on leases in some
Yeah.
cases. And
Corporate real
it's like,
estate. Yeah.
yeah, and it's like, well, is your job to fill seats in an office, or is your
Hmm.
job to build a better product for your customers? Because,
Yep.
like there's been a lot of showing that, people are being very productive working from home and are much happier. And like, why would you want to get rid of that so that, you can, fulfill your leases? It's like, it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to me,
I have a
unless you
whole.
have overwhelming data that they will be, you know, happier, better, and more productive in the office. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it blows my mind. But
Yeah,
anyways, I
I have a
digress.
whole rant about this. I find it very ironic that most of the companies that profited the most from the pandemic and work from home are all of a sudden saying, "Hey, go back into the office." Like I find it very ironic, and I'll just leave it at that. Um,
Yeah.
so as we're wrapping up, I want to be mindful of time. I think we're a bit over. Like if we, I would love to kind of get your thoughts. I do have like one final question, and it's hopefully it's not it's not a bad one. If you can kind of think about your career in tech, and think about all the things that you've done, the conversation that you and I have had over the last hour or so, the community around open source, the community around technology, and you had a feeling, but you only had one word to describe what that feeling would be, what would it be for you? And you can cheat.
Wow.
You can use one or two word. You can use two or three words. That's fine, but one word preferred.
Oh, wow. Uh, Gosh, I don't know. I guess the word that comes to my mind is excitement.
Excitement. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't disagree. Whenever every day I wake up and I get excited about like, oh, maybe something new technology wise came out that can make me a better developer or a better human or what have you. So I totally agree with the excitement. And as we wrap up, I'd love to give you an opportunity to, add any parting words or things that you'd like folks to learn about. And for folks, just if you're looking to learn more about Phil and what he's doing, you can find him on Twitter. So Hacked, Haacked, and you can find him on Threads as well at the same handle. And obviously, if you want to check out Abbot, so ab.bot, is there anything else, Phil, that you'd like to add?
Oh no, I think we've pretty much covered it all. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and like I think the main thing is like there's a lot to complain about in the industry, and there's a lot of, and I think it's good to call out abuse, call out all these, bad things for what they are. But, also like not to lose sight or touch of like, what is it about like tech and programming that got you into it in the first place that you enjoy? And, not everyone needs to be passionate about it. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think that's a prerequisite, but, I think, if you look at what's enjoyable about it, you can find that it's a really great and fun job to do, right? Like I have a lot of friends with a lot of different kinds of jobs that I would not enjoy.
Sure.
And I just
Yeah.
think like, oh, like I'm so fortunate. I think that big thing is like, I hope you feel fortunate that if you're able to do this kind of work and get paid well for doing it,
Hmm.
that you feel a lot of like very fortunate and want to pay that forward, to others, right? Because I think people think that they're very skilled and they made their success happen, and I don't think they realize how much luck comes into it. That you're
Yeah.
born in a country that had the infrastructure, or that you had the skill set to do it. Like so a lot. There's so much luck involved, um, and so much that the infrastructure around you contributes to that, right? Like, that we have paved roads so we can get to the school that taught us how to think and all that. Anyways,
Yeah.
so I think a lot about how fortunate I am that I'm in the position I am and that I get to do this type of work because I really do, love doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I'm still looking for the person that has gotten to where they are and they're successful without any luck involved. I'm still looking. Not sure if I'll find them, but I'm still looking. But you mentioned something that I just want to end on, like, fortunate for the situation. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I get to chat with you for an hour because I think learning from you, learning about your background, learning about the things you're passionate about drives me to be a better developer, better person, and overall I enjoy this conversation so much. And I hope that the folks listening in and watching it live, or as well as listening later, you enjoyed it as well. So, Phil, did you have anything last to say?
No, thank
That's
you.
it. And thank you so much, everybody else. Enjoy the rest of your day. This is Isaac Levin